Okay, now I want to talk about Chapter 11. Um, just going to discuss patterns of population growth. It starts, as the other chapters, with a case study, in particular this one, looking in the Black Sea, which is at the interface between Europe and Asia. And this particular type of organism, it's not quite a jellyfish, but what's called a comb jelly, so it's similar, that was introduced into the Black Sea in the 1980s. Probably in the ballast of a ship where the larva would be in a very small form, and then it gets pumped out of the ship and grows up, and all of a sudden you've got a new species present. Turns out this comb jelly, whose name I'm not even going to try to say, has a very voracious appetite. It eats a lot of fish. And so what happened after this organism was introduced, of course at first there were very few of them, but its number shot up. One of the particular fish species in particular that was favored, which population came down. The zooplankton population shot up, and chlorophyll, which is essentially a way of measuring phytoplankton, also increased significantly during this time period as well. So you can see the introduction of the species appears to have some cascading effects on the whole system, and we'll talk about that towards the end of the chapter. We'll come back to this now. All right, so the growth of a population or change in numbers at a given period of time relative to a previous time is going to be a function of things that increase the population, that is births and immigrants, and those that take away from the population, deaths and emigration, individuals leaving the population. So any one of those four things can have an influence on population, whether it's growing or shrinking or staying the same. So, for example, immigration can play a role, and in fact, immigration to a new place. So here's this organism called the cattle egret, which is native to Africa, but it was dispersed to South America accidentally. And you can see in the 1930s to North South America, and then it spread throughout South America and North America over time. And of course, during that time, its population grew. It dispersed to an area that was new to it, and it took to the area quite nicely, you might say. So in that case, a population that is new to an area often does exhibit what we call exponential growth. Now, because of the carrying capacity, it does eventually reach a point at which it levels off. This is not exactly a natural species, but it is an introduction. These were sheep that were not native to Tasmania, an island south of Australia, but they were introduced there. And so their population size increased a great deal and then leveled off as basically they were sort of using the resources there to their maximum extent. And the farmers were not able to essentially raise any more sheep. You can see it bounces around, but it kind of hovers around a mean of somewhere under 2 million sheep. All right, so I'll come back to that in a second. Now, populations do not always hover necessarily around a mean that well. That is, their populations can go up and down a lot. They can go through what we call boom and bust cycles. That is, they go through these rapid growth periods, becomes very large, and then they sometimes crash down to a very small size. And so, as exhibited by these, species rarely just sit right on the carrying capacity. They tend to move around. And this is the idea of why we think this happens. So, when a population is relatively small or low density, you should have relatively high births and low deaths. There's plenty of space and resources, and so the offspring that are born tend to do well and the population grows. Now, as density increases, births will tend to decline and death rate will tend to increase, and you reach a sort of an equilibrium of those two, the carrying capacity. Now, this is sort of showing births and death rates following a very narrow line, but in reality, they'll often basically fluctuate in these time periods such that where that equilibrium point is at any one time can cover a range. So that can explain why here this population is basically shifting throughout this range. Now, another example of something that can influence a population. Here we had this mountain pine beetle that was introduced to these western forests, and it loves to feed on these trees and burrow into the bark, and it disrupts the vascular system such that the tree dies. And so this is an example of where an introduced species, an introduced pest, if you will, can have a significantly negative impact on a population, essentially increasing this part of the equation. Also, predators can play a role. Here are these things called lemmings, these small mammals that you find in northern Europe. Here's this type of weasel. And so the lemming populations can increase a great deal because they have high reproductive rates. But then that means there's going to be plenty of food for the weasels, and their population will then grow, which will increase the predation pressure on the lemmings, and their population will decline. And it just kind of keeps going through this cycle again, hovering around the approximate carrying capacity. This in this case at least, influenced significantly by the presence of a predator. All right, so we saw in the previous chapter, and we modeled this idea here, this logistic equation, which shows this nice smooth curve approaching the carrying capacity and leveling off. We saw in the previous section that populations rarely, if ever, just get to the carrying capacity and stay there. So they fluctuate around that carrying capacity. This is described, or can be explained, I should say, by what's referred to as delayed density dependence. And that is a population can essentially overshoot its carrying capacity because of a delay in the factors that will limit that population. That is, it grows faster than the limiting factors can kick in. And a modification of our logistic equation of n right here, essentially, instead of the n being the current population size, if the growth rate of the population is really influenced by the size of the population 2, 3, or 4 steps or years in the past, that can essentially create this sort of cycling that occurs. And the bigger the difference between n, the current time, and the time that's having an impact, if it's further in the past, that leads to more significant oscillations around the carrying capacity and sort of a continuous oscillation around the carrying capacity. And so here's an experiment that was done attempting to study this idea of delayed density dependence. And it looked at these things called blowflies. And blowflies are rather nasty flies. They not only bite a host and sort of drink blood and fluids from them, but they lay their larvae on a host, like a cow or a sheep or even a human if they have the chance. And the larva will hatch out and basically feeds on the host. Fortunately, we don't have these up in North America, but they do down in South America and probably Africa, I'm not sure. So in this experiment, what they did was the adults in the experimental populations got unlimited food, but the maggots, that is their offspring, their food was limited. And so that generated this sort of boom and bust cycle of population growth. Why is that? Well, what they think, or the explanation is, so the adults essentially have plenty of food and they can do quite well and lay lots of eggs. But what's going to happen? So as that adult population grows and lays lots of eggs, the amount of food that is available to the offspring they have becomes limiting, and essentially that will eventually, or with a delay, cause the adult population to decrease. Now, after the adult population decreases, they're going to lay fewer eggs, and now there should be plenty of food for those relatively few offspring. Those offspring do well, they mature into adults, the population can then grow, but then you just continuously go through this cycle where ultimately the offspring are limited by the amount of food, but there's always going to be a delay in the response. Now, they modified the experiment in which they then not only had limited food for the offspring, the maggots, but they limited the amount of food for the adults. And what did they get? It didn't quite go through this boom and bust. It reached a somewhat, not completely, but a somewhat more stable population in which survival of the offspring and survival of the adults were more in sync, such that it didn't go through these boom and bust cycles anymore. Okay, so I'll stop there with the first two sections and do the next two sections in another video.